Robert Reich has a piece out at his blog site. They've marginalized Bernie at every turn, is the way he puts it. He writes, a friend told me for what seemed like the 1000th time, Bernie did well last weekend, but he can't possibly win the nomination, attaching an article from the Washington Post that shows how far behind Bernie remains in delegates. Wait a minute. Last Tuesday, Sanders won 78% of the vote in Idaho, 79% in Utah. This past Saturday, he took 82% of the vote in Alaska, 73% in Washington, and 70% in Hawaii. In fact, since March 15th, Bernie has won 6 out of the 7 Democratic primary contests with an average margin of victory of 40 points. Those victories have given him roughly 100 additional pledged delegates. As of now, Hillary Clinton has a 54.9% of the pledged delegates to Bernie Sanders' 45.1%. That's still a sizable gap, but it doesn't make Bernie an impossibility. Moreover, there are 22 states to go, with nearly 45% of pledged delegates still up for grabs, and Bernie has positive momentum in almost all of them. Hillary Clinton's lead in superdelegates will vanish if Bernie gains a majority of pledged delegates. Bernie's outpacing Hillary Clinton in fundraising. In February, he raised $42 million from 1.4 million contributions averaging $30 each, compared to her $30 million. In January, he raised $20 million to her $15 million. And all of this comes in small contributions. By any measure, the enthusiasm for Bernie is huge and keeps growing. He's packing stadiums. Young people are flocking to volunteer. Support is rising among the middle-aged and the boomers. In Idaho and Alaska, he exceeded the record primary turnout in 2008, bringing thousands of new voters. He did the same thing in Colorado, Kansas, Maine, Michigan. Yet if you read the Washington Post or the New York Times or watch CNN or even MSNBC or listen to the major pollsters and pundits, you'll come to the same conclusion as my friend. Every success by Bernie is met with a story or column or talking head whose message is, but he can't possibly win. Some Sanders supporters speak in dark tones about a media conspiracy against Bernie. Well, that's baloney. The mainstream media are incapable of conspiring with anyone or anything. They wouldn't dare try. Their reputations are on the line. If the public stops trusting them, their brands are worth nothing. The real reason the major media can't see what's happening is because the national media exists inside the bubble of establishment politics centered in Washington and the bubble of establishment power centered in New York. As such, the major national media are interested mainly in personalities and in the money behind the personalities. Political reporting is dominated by stories about the quirks and foibles of the candidates and about the people and resources behind them. Within this frame of reference, it seems nonsensical that a 74-year-old Jew from Vermont, originally from Brooklyn, who calls himself a Democratic socialist, who's not a Democratic insider, and wasn't even a member of the Democratic Party until recently, who has never been a fixture in Washington or Manhattan circles of power and influence, and who has no major backers among the political or corporate or Wall Street elites of America, could possibly win the nomination. But precisely because the major media are habituated to paying attention to personalities, they haven't been attending to Bernie's message or to its resonance among Democratic and independent voters, as well as many Republicans. The major media don't know how to report on movements. In addition, because the major media depend on the wealthy and powerful for revenues, because the reporters and columnists rely on the establishment for news and access, because their top media personalities socialize with the rich and powerful and are themselves rich and powerful, and because their publishers and senior executives are themselves part of the establishment, the major media have come to see much of America through the eyes of the establishment. So it's understandable, even if unjustifiable, that the major media haven't noticed how determined Americans are to reverse the increasing concentration of wealth and political power that have been eroding our economy and democracy. And it's understandable, even if unjustifiable, that they continue to marginalize Bernie Sanders. Good point, Mr. Reich. That's the thing about Sanders, and nobody can say it as powerfully, I don't think, as Robert Reich. You know, he himself was part of the establishment. What was he, Secretary of Labor in the first Clinton administration? And I think he realized what he was involved in and got out. He's back to being a professor, right? Economist, professor, whatever. I know he's a professor. I don't know if he's an economist. I guess so. But his description of Sanders is so right on target. A guy from Vermont, born and raised in Brooklyn, the first Jew to even attempt to do this. A democratic socialist who wasn't even a member of the Democratic Party until recently. Doesn't that speak volumes? It does to me, and I know it does to you too. I know it does to you, or you wouldn't be listening to this program. Or this podcast, whatever the hell this is. I don't even know anymore. And more, every day that goes by, when I am, and I do this, listening to MSNBC at various times during the day, and occasionally I even switch over to Wolf Blitzer on CNN, very seldom. But I listen to everybody on MSNBC periodically. And what Reich just said, or just wrote, is so absolutely correct. But these people in media, like Reich just wrote, they don't understand a movement. They don't get it. When you look at people like, just an example, piss poor example, but Morning Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski, when they got invited out to hobnob with the Koch brothers, play a little grab ass with them, with the rich and powerful, the really rich and powerful. And they come back from that. I'll never forget. This was, I don't know, several months back. And the morning after that weekend, I guess it was a Monday, and, you know, I'm getting Molly's lunch ready for school, and I'm watching MSNBC, and I hear Mika Brzezinski say, well, a variation of this, I'm not quoting her directly, well, you know, Joe and I spent some time in wherever it was, with the Koch brothers. They're very interesting. They're really nice people. Oh, fuck. Really? Really, Mika? Really? Well, of course. Mika Brzezinski, you know, the fruit doesn't fall too far from the tree, does it? If you are aware of Zbigniew Brzezinski's actions as Jimmy Carter's Secretary of State, wasn't he? And the kind of shit, it was Zbigniew who came up with the brilliant idea of providing the Mujahideen in Afghanistan with missile launchers, surface-to-air missiles to fight the Soviets. in order to embarrass the Soviets. And it worked. They had to leave. The Russians turned and bugged out. They left. And part of that was because the mothers of the Russian soldiers who were coming back in boxes, coming back in body bags, coming back dead and shot up, the mothers started to revolt. And the Soviet Union could not sustain what they were doing in Afghanistan. But in the meantime, there's Mika Brzezinski's dad convincing Jimmy Carter, I don't know how much convincing it took, but getting him to provide all this weaponry to the Mujahideen. You know what the Mujahideen are called now? The Taliban. And you know what they're called in some parts of the world? ISIS.